All right, our next speaker is Bethany Natli, and her presentation is entitled Indiana Now is Lettuce Land. Thank you so much. Can we give a warm warning for Bethany?
Thank you. Yeah, I realized after I came up with this title how hard it is to say, so that's going to be fun as we go through this. It's just a little bit. Hello, I'm Bethany Natli. I am very glad to be here today discussing German market gardening in southern Marion County, just south of where we are right now. I'll start by looking at the history of this practice and how it influenced the landscape, especially along a particular area of Perry Township, that's Bluff Road. We'll look at some of the defining characteristics of this practice of gardening and how those characteristics can be used to help in research or identification. And then I'll conclude by looking at some Bluff Road examples from that district that we identified through federal compliance, and also look at some of the opportunities and limitations of federal compliance. So as a quick bit of background, I served as a co-author, researcher, and surveyor for the Bluff Road Historic District's National Register nomination. Along with that nomination, we prepared a cover document called a multiple property document form. And that basically provides a context and a path for additional nominations in the future. We did know a bit about gardening going into this project, thanks to some available sources. We had an Indiana Historic Bureau marker in the area. Also, we have a county survey program in our state that had identified some of the garden resources. But once we really started to look at Bluff Road as a potential district, our greatest source of information came from the members of this community, many of whom have been in the area for generations. They were really generous with their time, explaining to us how their gardens actually function, and shared stories of their family histories. And as I walk through this presentation, many of the images you'll see were provided by the families. Okay. So, what do we mean by market gardening? Well, historically, we're talking about a specific type of agriculture. It uses fewer acres to produce fruits, vegetables, or nursery goods. And in Indianapolis, those gardens were largely operated by German families. So while not all German farmers were market gardeners, it is fair to say that nearly all market gardeners in Indianapolis, especially in the early and late 20th century, were born in Germany or had German heritage. Gardeners also sold their goods directly to consumers at places like City Market. I have a picture of City Market here. They also sold to larger buyers like warehouses or hotels. Sometimes the practice is called truck farming, and you can see in this 1930s pictures, they literally carried their goods in trucks. So it does kind of come from truck farming as far as the automobile goes. We also understand that that term comes from a French word, troqueur, which means to barter, and that refers to how they would have negotiated with consumers. In Indianapolis, the tradition probably dates to the 1860s. That's when the Indianapolis Gartner Verein, or Indianapolis Gardeners Association, was founded as a mutual benefit society. They later changed their name to Deutschen Gartner Unterstützungsvereins, or German Gardeners Benefit Society. And the images on the right are the Constitution and bylaws from 1920, but you can see that they're written in both English and German. And many of the farmers are coming directly from Westphalia, Rhineland, or even Alsace, which is now part of France. So as Indianapolis starts to urbanize after the Civil War, we see this pattern where some German farmers start buying land outside the city limits in Perry Township to the south. which is along the White River. The farmers like being along the White River because its sandy soil makes it easier to cultivate crops during colder months. And by 1880, there are 50 folks of German ancestry working in agriculture in Marion County. So on the left is this map of Bluff Road in Perry Township in 1866, just prior to the gardeners arriving in the area. And this map reflects a more typical land ownership model in Indiana for agriculture. A lot of the farms are between 40 and 150 acres, and especially in central Indiana and also northern Indiana, we tend to think of the corn and hog economy, where there's a larger farm based on a section and township boundary and operations that focus on one or two cash crops, such as grain or livestock products. By 1909, on the right, you can see the area starts to look very different, and it kind of clues us in that something unique is happening here. By this time, the market gardeners have become pretty established in the area. Instead of a single cash crop, they tend to raise a variety of vegetables like tomatoes, lettuce, onions, spinach, turnips, and kale. And they do this on characteristically smaller pieces of land with ribbon-like farms and minimal road frontage. So these dots indicate structures all very close to the road. Another clue we had is a lot of the German surnames that we see over and over again, like Brehab and Begehoft. One interesting note we found is that some of the families locating along Bluff Road actually had bought farms a little farther away and then moved to Bluff Road. And we think this happened for a couple of reasons. One is Bluff Road is an improved route into the city. And a second reason is that it was reportedly well drained, which would have been great for agriculture. So by the early 20th century, market gardens themselves reflect a combination of traditional techniques and newer practices. Gardeners tend to operate their farms as families. A lot of the practices are handed down through tradition or an apprenticeship model. At the same time, organizations like the Benefit Society and Purdue University begin to share and showcase best practices. So thanks to these organizations, the greenhouse becomes an important part of a successful market garden. Greenhouses provide protection from the elements, they allow gardeners to regulate internal temperatures, and they extended the growing season. Greenhouses allow farmers to grow early crops of vegetables, which were popular with buyers. However, one farmer noted in 1902 that there was not a big market for early onions, so I don't know, that might be the case in my household too. So this is an undated photo from the Pieper family who live along Bluff Road, and it shows a number of greenhouses on their property, along with a chimney, which you can see here, a water tank, and a windmill. All of these would have been used to operate the greenhouse. We also have a picture from the Indianapolis Star here, which is the inside of the greenhouse with rows of lettuce. Lettuce does become a hallmark of this industry. And I like this photo because it shows a child working with the adults, which really illustrates the generational model of farming. We also found this ad for a truck farm, and it really does, it's from 1922, it's in Perry Township, and it really does include some of the typical elements you would expect to see on a market garden. So it's very small. It's only 3 acres, they have fruit trees, a grape arbor, greenhouses, a house, and a horse and a truck. The market gardeners in Perry Township and on Bluff Road really prospered in the 1930s and 1940s, so the Depression did not really seem to impact this segment of agriculture. And a new organization, the Marion County Greenhouse Growers Association, had formed in the 1920s. This is one of their ads. And they formed with the intent of promoting quality standards and having group buying power for supplies and for selling. The association did begin selling products under the Hoosier Boy label, and here is an ad featuring lettuce as a salad treat that they're inviting you to enjoy. And I don't know, yeah. Lettuce is a big thing. Actually, in 1936, there was an article, which is where I got the title of my presentation in the Indianapolis Star, that says, "Ancients may have had their lotus land, but Indiana now is lettuce land." So lettuce was big. The article goes on to say that the gardeners sold their products locally, but also to markets by that time in Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit, Toledo, and Milwaukee. And peak production happened in the 1940s. At that time, Marion County had the highest concentration of greenhouses in the country, with 40 acres under glass. And the Marion County Ag Extension agent at that time estimated that the vegetables grown under glass and in these market gardens, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a second, represented about half of all income for Marion County's farmers. After World War II, the industry does begin to change as the city starts growing and land outside the city core becomes more expensive. And it does really begin to decrease in the 1970s as refrigeration creates competition from California and Florida growers. But during our survey, we found many families still continuing the tradition. And in fact, a focus on locally sourced produce has sparked some renewed interest in the area. So what I'd like to do is look a little bit more at the Bluff Road Historic District. I have a couple photos of the district from 1958. On the right is the National Register boundary. And I just wanted to point out some of the features of the landscape that can indicate a market garden. So these small field patterns indicate single crops. Also, you'll see these like grouped gable structures that indicate the greenhouses. You'll also notice this concentration of buildings close to the road to maximize agriculture to the rear. And this is kind of a summary of what we were looking for when we were identifying these resources. So the small acreage, the narrow road frontage, the residences closer to the road. And then once we got on the ground for the survey, we found some common patterns. The family homes, which we have an example here, came in a variety of styles, but bungalows, four squares, and sort of European revival inspired were probably the most popular. Ranch styles become very popular after World War II. Of course, we did find greenhouses. There are still a lot of greenhouses in the area. These structures do tend to be more temporary, so not every grower kept their greenhouses or kept historic era greenhouses. So sometimes we have modern greenhouses. Those were considered non-contributing for the National Register, but they're still very evocative if you're driving along Perry Road or Perry Township or Bluff Road. We also looked for boilers. We have an example here that would have been used to heat the greenhouses along with these chimneys. So a few examples. This is the Vegahoff Farm Complex. This is one of my favorite examples demonstrating the generational model of farming. You can see the homes are arranged very close to the road up here. And with the exception of the first house, the other two houses have that cottage revival feel. Fred Vegahoff was the patriarch of the family, and he was apparently an early adopter of the market truck and provided this testimonial in 1920 for the Smith Forma truck, and he noted that he used his truck in daily service for his garden activities. The Brahab farm is just north of the Vegahoft operation. And in addition to the house, you can see the barn and some greenhouses. This operation combined with the Vegahoff operation in the 1980s, and then more recently it was sold to a larger company and still retains the name Brahab Nursery for the overall complex. And when we did our survey, they still employ members of the family. We also have the Schlegel Farm on Sprague Street, so it's just a little bit off of Bluff Road, and it includes a historic era farmhouse, historic greenhouse, as well as some modern greenhouses, a boiler house, and a chimney. The farm was established in the 1920s by the Schlensker family, and then Louis F. Schlegel acquired it in 1972, and his son and his son's family currently operate it. I wanted to point out this farm because they're continuing the Hoosier Boy brand, and you may see their goods in local markets around town. And then the Nearman complex is an example of a resource that lost its greenhouse, which you can see here, but it retained a boiler house and garage, which is here, its house, and also its historic field pattern. And because Bluff Road was so important to the gardeners to sell their goods, we also included transportation resources in the district. Bluff Road eventually became part of the Dixie Highway. And this bridge on the bottom is a circa 1930s concrete arch bridge that's associated with the highway. It's actually been determined individually eligible by our State Department of Transportation for its connection to the Dixie Highway. We also have this garage, the Shebler-Hartman garage. It dates a little earlier to the 1920s, and it was owned by William Shebler and later Edwin Hartman. And it really still does have that feeling of a garage, even though it's lost its tanks. And several of the families we spoke to remembered that the gardeners would come here to catch up on local news in addition to fuel up their trucks. So that is an overview of the district. What I'd like to do with the time I have left is touch on the role of federal policy and programs in identifying and promoting historic landscapes. So the Bluff Road District was identified as part of Section 106 studies for a project along I-465 in Indianapolis. Section 106 is a federal process that requires federal agencies to take into account the impact of their undertakings on historic properties. For the case of Section 106, a historic property is one that is listed in or eligible for the National Register. So as part of Section 106 compliance, we identified this district on behalf of NDOT as potentially eligible. NDOT and Federal Highway agreed with that, and so it was considered historic for Section 106 purposes. So while Section 106 is a preservation policy, it does not prevent development, and it doesn't prevent the acquisition of a historic resource. It does require an agency to examine a range of alternatives, and only if there's no feasible and prudent alternative can the agency proceed with an adverse effect to a historic resource. And unfortunately, that's what happened on Bluff Road. There was a small bungalow here that was acquired with the widening of the interstate bridge. But because of the adverse effect, Federal Highway sponsored the writing of a National Register nomination and the NPDF document. Another note about Section 106 is that it does not apply to projects that don't have federal involvement, like a permit or funding. So I mentioned that Bluff Road is listed on the National Register. Likewise, the National Register is an important national designation that a resource is important to our past. And it does give a resource notoriety. It provides a level of protection or consideration for federally assisted projects, or in Indiana, also state-assisted or state-funded projects. Owners of resources can be eligible for rehab credits or grants, but the National Register does not prevent private owners from altering their properties, doesn't restrict the sale, and it does not limit locally or privately funded projects from damaging historic resources. So, while both the National Register listing and Section 106 process are important to the recognition of historic resources, they do not prevent development. So that does conclude my presentation.
Questions?
From what we could find initially, it was primarily German, people of German birth, and then by the early 20th century, it was still, because it was a family operation, it was peoples of German heritage, and then I think that model began to change maybe at mid-century, but yeah, we focus mostly on the German aspect of it.
Great presentation. I love it, especially as we grew up in German American. Also, as a former employee at the advisory council, I know that you understand the law about how feasible and proven alternative. I wanted to clarify for the audience that only applies to the federal highway administration.
Yes, I'm sorry, that was a federal highway, yes.
Because we would love it if that applied to all properties, but for roads, when there is no feasible proven alternative, they are allowed to proceed with historic properties.
Yes, thank you for clarifying that. I think I kind of breezed over that a little bit, but the project was it was an INDOT and federal highway project. It was receiving federal funding, and so we were following the federal federal highway section 106 regulations. So yeah, thank you for that.
Building off that comment, have you seen anything about Dutch? Because my dad is a food biz guy, and I don't know if he's pranking me, but he lovingly says that if you wanted to build a greenhouse in Marion County, you had to have a connection with the Dutch mafia. And he says I love it.
I like this.
I searched everywhere, and I can't find any documentation. So I'm curious if you've seen anything about a Dutch connection.
So I like that. One thing I didn't get into too much in this presentation is who built the greenhouses. And we did find some examples of like plans. There was a company, I think the Moringer company issued plans and could build greenhouses. I think some people did it themselves, but we think that there were people that were building greenhouses that we don't know who they were. So now I kind of want to run that down, but we'll see.
I don't know what it's like in Indiana, but in Pennsylvania, Dutch refers to the Pennsylvania German. So Deutsch. Comes from the word Deutsch. They're called Pennsylvania Dutch, but they're not from the Netherlands. So there's no Dutch connection.
We did, just to tag off of that, we did find there's at least another concentration of these gardens in Cincinnati that was pretty big. So that just got me thinking about that too. So.
You mentioned Cincinnati. Are there comparables that would be deemed? I'm from Minnesota, Indianapolis, St. Paul, particular area of it was filled with big German greenhouses. Actually commercial flower growing, but also vegetable growing.
And a lot of our families did convert to more nursery later in the 20th century. I do think that there are likely other places, particularly in the Midwest, where you might find this model. I've been told there might be something in Fort Wayne. So I expect that they exist elsewhere. They did exist historically.
It's sort of a pragmatic question. I really appreciate the documentation of agricultural landscapes. I think it's so important. When you were doing your multi-property document, how did you set the boundaries? Was it boundaries at a district scale, and then each individual property would be added?
So our boundary is Perry Township, Marion County, Indiana. And we have categories for districts as well as individual resources that may rise to the level individually. And that actually, those confines of what the NPDF was for and where we prepared one nomination for came from that mitigation with Federal Highway and NDOT.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.